Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Cheryl McDonald. I'm the Associate Director of Outreach at the St. Mary's University Center for the Study of Sport and Health. I'm also the chair of the conference organizing committee. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that St. Mary's University is located in Mi'kmaq, the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. I also want to take a moment to quickly acknowledge the discovery of 215 bodies of Indigenous children in British Columbia as well. All right, so this morning, I am honored to present the inaugural Dr. Colin Howell Distinguished Lecture. I am going to forego opening remarks because Dr. Colin Howell started the hockey conference 20 years ago this year, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the history of the conference. And we are also excited to have his very last graduate student. So Dr. MacIntosh Ross was Colin's very last graduate student, and if I'm not mistaken, I was Colin's very last postdoctoral scholar. So Mac is going to talk a little bit about Colin's contributions to the field. We want to make sure that everyone knows Colin has arrived this morning clad in his St. Mary's University hockey jersey, which we had made for him in honor of his 50 years at St. Mary's. And before I hand it off to Mac, I want to thank you all for being here, especially those of you. I see some names here among the 50 some odd of us that I know are in British Columbia and California, and I know you were up very early for this, so I appreciate you being here. So without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Mac. I will then pop back on to introduce Colin properly. And if there's time at the end of the session, we can open it up to questions.
Okay, so as Cheryl said, Colin's final graduate student. I am now an assistant professor at Western University teaching sport management and history. And it was difficult for me to decide what exactly I was going to say about Colin Howell. Not because he's lived an uneventful life, but because his impact on the fields of Atlantic history and sports studies, his contributions to society, his dedication to his students are so vast and varied that preparing such a talk would inevitably mean I have to leave some things out. So with that in mind, I did my best to capture what Colin meant to me as a professor, a scholar, and just as importantly, a friend and a mentor. Colin did his BA and MA at Dalhousie University, finishing up the latter in 1967. He spent a little bit of time as a secondary school teacher before hitting the road to do a PhD at the University of Cincinnati. While completing his doctoral work, Colin taught as a lecturer at Dalhousie, Cincinnati, Wilmington College, but ultimately accepted a position in 1970. And it was at SMU his academic career. In 1976, back at Cincinnati, he completed a dissertation titled "The Eclipse of Canadian Nationalism, Provincial Allegiances, and the Federal Idea in Canada." At this point, he was already an assistant professor at SMU, but promptly attained the rank of associate professor just 2 years later. Colin wore a lot of hats in 1985, and serving as director of both the Gorsebrook Research Institute for Atlantic Canadian Studies and the Center for Sport and Health. He's authored 3 books: A Century of Care, A History of the Victoria General Hospital in Halifax, Northern Sandlots, of course, A Social History of Maritime Baseball, and Blood, Sweat, and Cheers, Sport and the Making of Modern Canada. His service to the academic community has been no less extensive. He was the co-editor of the Canadian Historical Review and has served in various capacities on the boards of the Canadian Bulletin of the History of Medicine, Acadiensis, Sport History Review, and the Journal of Sport History. His dozens of articles have appeared across a wide variety of journals, including numerous contributions to Atlantic Canadian history for Acadiensis. It was Colin, as we all know, who started the hockey conference back in 2001. And since then, we've met multiple times, including stops in Buffalo, Plymouth, London, Victoria, Edmonton, and 3 stops in Halifax, not including today's event. So I know we're all gathered here today to discuss the different dimensions of hockey. But I think it's important to take a moment to acknowledge the breadth of contributions to Atlantic Canadian history more broadly. One need only look at his graduate students to see how important he's been to the development of the region's history. And by my count, there's over 24. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to demonstrate the breadth of these contributions by acknowledging some of his graduate students and Colin's our work with these graduate students. So there was Terrence White, The History of Colchester County, Mary Ellen Wright, Economic and Social Change in Truro, Nova Scotia, Michael Smith, Female Reformers in Victorian, Nova Scotia, Dan Bunbury, the Halifax Government Savings Bank, Kathleen McKenzie, Public Healthcare in Industrial Cape Breton, Peter Tuig, Healthcare and the Mi'kmaq, Beverly Williams, Leisure in 19th Century, Ross, Motor Coach Service in the Maritimes, Victor Sill, Halifax Shipyards, Jeffrey Gibbs, National Trade, David Hood, School Reform in Victorian Halifax, Gillis, Nova Scotia, Kimberly Berry, Reg Fellon, Land Struggle in Prince Edward Island, Sheridan Hay, Black Protest in Nova Scotia, Moira Ross, Arthur Samuel Kendall, His Life and Times, Mike Petru, Mi'kmaq Medicine and Western Biomedicine, Sharon McDonald, Nova Scotia, Colin, Andrew, Halifax Civic Improvement League, Cindy Kiley, Churches, Rinks, and Schools as Social Anchors in Nova Scotia, Megan Beaton, the Canso Causeway and Region, Mark Koschel, Recreation and Leisure for Sailors in St. John and Halifax, Marlene Williger, the Maritime Women's Christian Temperance Union, Dan McDonald, Rugby in Cape Breton, Peter Walker, British Sport in Nova Scotia, Daryl Leeworthy, Rugby, Religion, and Working Class Culture in Cape Breton and the South of Wales, and myself, Boxing in Interwar, Nova Scotia. So quite an extensive range of topics over a very decorated career. My own experiences with Colin speak volumes about the kind of person and scholar and continues to be to son me is probably an understatement. After writing an honors thesis in mid after a 4th year seminar that I wanted to be a historian of sport in Atlantic Canada. I pitched him a topic about boxing in interwar Nova Scotia, and despite my unusual path to this thesis at Mary's University, basically changing my life forever. Colin was more than a mentor from the very start. He was blunt and honest about my limitations, but determined and tactful when it came to my growth as a historian. For every problem, there was a solution, but it was up to me to learn it, apply it, and see it through to completion. At the same time, he encouraged me to go fishing and maintain some degree of work-life balance. This may not seem like much, but that canoe multicolored eyesore better suited for the lake that Colin lived on. When it finally succumbed to the elements collapsing under a particularly heavy snowfall, Colin and his wife Sandy notified me, apologizing for the vessel's overdue demise. I appreciated the feigned concern for Old Leaky. As a historian, I hadn't really progressed as fast as some of those around me. It's not an excuse, but I grew up in the mighty village of Badek, population 900, and may have got a little bit caught up in the wonders of Halifax nightlife. Colin had a knack for showing concern through humor. When I walked into the office, eyes blackened from a particularly stupid adventure, he would simply quip, "Conducting some ethnographic research again?" The tone said it all. It was Colin's way of saying, "I see what's going on. It's time for you to sort it out and get serious." And I did somewhat. Academic conference, basically to spark a flame under me. I had been accepted to the University of Western Ontario for a PhD, but still wasn't making enough progress to realistically expect to take them up on that offer. So Colin and Sandy packed my office mate, Daryl Leeworthy, and I packed us up and drove us from Halifax to Lake Placid, New York for the annual North American Society for Sport History Convention. I vividly recall the reception. Colin walked Daryl and I around the room, introducing us to all the scholars we'd come to appreciate through his seminar in sport history, many of whom have appeared at the hockey conference in one capacity or another, folks like Carly Adams, Don Morrow, Fred Mason, and Charlene Weaving. He also introduced me to my future PhD advisor, Kevin Walmsley. It's hard to overstate how important these kinds of introductions are to a young scholar. It's very intimidating to just walk up to someone you admire. Colin took that anxiety away. And of course, the big stressor was actually going to be presenting in front of a bunch of experts, which I had never done. But before the end of the reception, I remember Colin reaching his arms around me and Daryl and simply stating, "I am fiercely protective of my graduate students." And I've embraced those words as a sort of mantra to put my own students at ease, a rule to live by. After the conference, Colin wanted Daryl and I to experience New York City. We stopped in Tarrytown, where he and Sandy would stay, and he put this Cape Breton villager and his Welsh friend on a train for the Big Apple. Security measures were tighter than we expected, and our hostel demanded passports for identification. One of us didn't have one. We had come to terms with sleeping behind a rock in Central Park when Colin came through once again, securing the passport in time to keep us out of the elements for the evening. For some people, a trip to New York City may not seem like a big deal, but Colin knew this would be a major learning experience for his graduate students, perhaps me more than Daryl. Again, I emphasize, I'm from a village of 900 people. I'd been to Ottawa, but that was about it. I'd never left Canada. Wandering New York changed my whole outlook on life. Books could not do it justice. When we made it back to Colin's house, we sat up reflecting on the exciting ideas we'd heard and what folks had said about our own papers. Then we had a serious talk. I was supposed to start my PhD at Western in just over 2 months. There was still lots of research and writing to do. I decided to do this. It's not impossible, but it's going to be hard. And of course, I panicked. I teared up a bit on his couch. I stared blankly into the wall. Sandy asked me if I needed a tea, and Colin assured her that I needed something quite a bit stiffer. By the end of the night, it was resolved that come hell or high water, that damn thesis would be done so I could attend Western. I wrote some good stuff and I wrote some really bad stuff. Colin did what few supervisors would ever dare to do, something I will be forever grateful for. He and Sandy moved me into their house, gave me a room, banned me from the leaky canoe, and fed me while I finished my thesis. Colin basically showed me how to write clearly and concisely. My grandparents lived just up the road from Colin and marveled at his mentorship. From that point forward, they didn't ask if I was going to visit my supervisor, or rather my friend, because what he did for me runs so far deeper than any mere academic arrangement, and even they could see that. Now a professor myself, I try to employ some of the lessons Colin passed on. First, work hard, but have passions beyond academia. Colin's ability to produce world-class scholarship while at the same time having an obsession with music, golf, and baseball shows that balance is not only possible, it's essential. Second, and I struggled with this for a long time, you can be critical of another scholar's work without being a jerk. We can disagree without being unpleasant. It should never be personal. And lastly, savor every moment you get to spend teaching and supervising. Only a handful of people in this world get to be a professor. When you get that opportunity to lend a helping hand to a student who desperately needs it, be fiercely protective in true Colin Howell style. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So obviously we have heard some wonderful things about Colin. I want to welcome the folks who have just joined us. I see, I don't know if Colin and or Mac you can see, but folks are clapping for you. You can use your reactions at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. So you're getting rounds of applause.
Thank you very much. It meant a lot to get to say a few words about Colin.
Means a lot to me too. I don't know.
Colin, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, go right ahead.
Okay. Well, Huskies jersey with the big number 50 after 50 years at St. Mary's. And thank her and the committee for all that they've done. And thanks, of course, to Mac for those words that almost brought tears to my eyes. My wife is Sandy is beside me here, and she's sniffing and crying at the moment. So I would like to thank as well. I'd like to thank Cheryl and members of the organizing committee, Heidi Weigen, John Reed, my good friend over the years, and Medina Vanderplaat, who has taken over the position of director at the Center for the Study of Sport and Health, Christy Elaine, Jonathan Edwards, and others for inviting me to present and to naming this lecture after me. I don't know what to say about that other than it's been wonderful. Of the involvement of and friendship of so many people over the years that have been involved in the hockey conference, and a general expression of gratitude to the entire hockey conference family. So here it goes, and I'm basically going to stick very closely to a prepared text because there are so many people that I want to acknowledge, and I don't really want to leave anybody out. So here we go, the hockey conference at 20, a retrospective look. Actually, when I started, I was going to do the whole 20 years and realized that would take an entire hour. So this is really the first decade of the hockey conference from 2001. It's at its inauguration until 2010. All-Star Games, the Stanley Cup playoffs, World Hockey Championships, the Olympics, CIS and NCAA tournaments. These mega hockey events demonstrates the game's ability to mobilize large audiences across the contemporary sporting universe and mediascape. They contribute to the veneration of the skills of elite athletes, underscore regional and metropolitan rivalries, and touch lives at the local, national, and international level. Ironically, the more these events serve to unify across the class, gender, ethnic, and racial divide, the more they reinforce elite sports' broader social hegemony, reproducing existing power relationships and entrenching corporate influence. The Hockey Conference, now 20 years old and in its 10th iteration, is another collective enthusiasm, but one that provides a unique and continuing opportunity to investigate both hockey's hegemonic character and its emancipatory influences and potential. The Hockey Conference has a history of its own. And so I'll take a retrospective look at that today, the contribution that all of you have made to the study of hockey in Canada and around the world. Although it may seem somewhat counterintuitive, the idea of the Hockey Conference grew out of my lifelong interest in baseball and the publication of my book, Northern Sandlots, in 1995. While I was in the midst of that project, a good friend of mine, Canadian historian Rosemary Omer, raised two important questions. Why was a Canadian studying baseball and not hockey? And why baseball in the Maritimes when it was more prominent elsewhere? Well, the answer to the first question was easy enough. When I started on that book in 1991, there was already an historiography involving baseball's social significance, its connections to larger questions involving class, gender, race, and ethnicity, and the way it operated as an implement of social change and progressive reform. Nothing like that existed at the time for hockey. Rick Greneau and David Whitson's groundbreaking Hockey Night in Canada, Sports, Identities, and Cultural Politics, 1993, had yet to appear, and Bruce Kidd's The Death of Hockey was a lonely critical voice in scholarly writing about the sport. By the mid-1990s, however, Canadian sport history began to flourish. And for the first time, Canadian academic historians began to appreciate the importance of integrating sport into larger historical debates. Along with Northern Sandlots, Bruce Kidd's The Struggle for Canadian Sport in 1996, and somewhat later Nancy Boucher's For the Love of the Game, helped propel discussions of sport into the forefront of Canadian history. Obviously, an investigation of the development of hockey and its connection to broader debates involving not only sports scholars, but Canadian historians in general, was long overdue. Rosemary Omer's second question about the importance of writing about sport in the Maritimes addressed another issue that had always concerned me. There was more to baseball in its big-time metropolitan and major league manifestations. And I knew that the history of hockey could hardly limit its focus to its development in larger urban centers and in the National Hockey League. Sport at the regional, community, and local levels was deeply implicated in the larger social and political debates of the time as well. Moreover, as I continued to research baseball as a multifaceted sport, I found many possible points of contact and connection with hockey. Black baseball in the Maritimes in the 1880s, and regular Maritime Black baseball championships in the early 1890s. Intrigued, I suggested to my graduate student, Sheldon Gillis, that he undertake a history of hockey in the region in the late 19th century to see if something similar existed here in the winter months. His MA thesis, completed in 1994, was in fact the first regional hockey championships beginning in 1896 and continuing into the 1920s, since described by some, including Bob Dawson, who will be on the program later this weekend, have described as the Nova Scotian Colored Hockey League. I knew then that we were just scratching the surface of a multifaceted game, what Cheryl McDonald and Jonathan Edwards. At that point, the idea of a series of conferences hosted by the Goresbrook Research Institute and the Center for the Study of Sport and Health at St. Mary's began to take shape. The first of these took place in 2001, and I shamelessly borrowed the title of Sheldon Gillis's MA thesis, Putting It on Ice, as the conference moniker. We cast a wide net. In addition to academics, we welcomed anyone interested in the game's history. We included on-ice sessions involving practitioners, coaches, and players. And we also inaugurated a game for conference participants, wobbly ankled academics, that became an enduring component of future conferences. And there were some stars as well. I still can remember, although it wasn't on ice, Jerry Backman, when we played a ball hockey game in the 2012 conference, shining on the pitch at that point. Sharp as well, obviously recognized we ranked 7th out of well over 100 applications for conference funding across the nation that year. In addition to its many participants, our commitment to cultural and regional diversity and honored their own contributions to the game. They included Montreal Canadiens hockey legend Jean Beliveau, who came to the 2001 conference and stayed there and went to the sessions every day of the conference. Stacey Wilson, 3-time Canadian women's team gold medalist from Salisbury, New Brunswick, and captain of the silver medal winning Team Canada at Nagano in 1998. John Paris Jr., the first Black coach in professional hockey. Former NHLer Everett Sanapath from the Elsipogtog First Nation in New Brunswick. And Canadian actor and broadcaster Austin Willis, an early member of the Hot Stove League of Hockey Night in Canada radio broadcasts before World War II. In the same spirit, we had papers from John Wong and Michel Vigneault on an Anglophone team in Quebec City before World War I, from local historian Garth Vaughan on the Colored Maritime Hockey Championships, building upon Sheldon Gillis's study, and Michael Robideau's paper entitled The Subaltern Framework of Aboriginal Hockey that resembled hockey. Going beyond hockey's history, David Battistella's elegant NFB film, Shinny, The Hockey in All of Us, actually premiered at the conference, extolling the virtues of the game in its less organized form on frozen lakes and ponds. Don Morrow offered up a literary analysis of Paul Corrington's hockey novels. And Michael Petro, another student of mine, Michael Petro's short story, Before the Spring, provided a poignant remembrance of a street hockey game gone wrong. There were sessions on community identities, on imagining hockey heroes, on hockey and social violence, numerous issues involving minor hockey, including emotional and sexual abuse of young players, marketing and economic development, arena construction from Maple Leaf Gardens to local community rinks, and the enduring origins question. When did hockey really become hockey anyway? The conference attracted international scholars from Finland, Sweden, Germany, and Russia, and a raft of papers on the development of the game around the world, including careful studies of hockey systems in various countries. Julie Stevens outlined what she called a process of institutional divergence and convergence. Hart Candelin revisited the introduction of hockey into the Soviet sports system. And Jani Messikainen chronicled the professionalization of hockey in Finland. Tobias Stark's paper, probably my favorite paper of the early conferences, The Pioneer, the Pal, and the Poet, contrasted the rugged individualism permeating Canadian hockey with the social democratic manifestations of the Swedish hockey system and the plan culture of the Soviet system. Sasha Kubushkin from Volgograd State University acknowledged the Cold War dimensions of the 1972 Summit Series, but argued that in Russia since then, it's been imagined as an initial step towards glasnost. Kubushkin actually returned to Halifax for the 2012 conference, and he began his presentation putting up a picture of the Russian premier in full hockey gear to highlight a very clever paper titled Putin on Ice. There was a notable disappointment. Of the 75 paper presentations, only a couple. So immediately we began planning for a successor conference, dealing exclusively with the women's game and gender issues on and off the ice. Since the Women's Worlds were going to be held in Halifax in 2004, we scheduled the conference for the days leading up to the opening of the tournament. And we were delighted medal at Nagano, and Ken Dryden, an acknowledged advocate of the women's game, agreed to serve as our conference co-captains. Both of them appeared in on-ice sessions with the St. Mary's and Dalhousie women's hockey teams. In addition, Bjorn Kinding, a former director of the Swiss Hockey Federation with high-level coaching experience in Sweden, Denmark, and throughout the world, and another former student of mine, Brian O'Byrne, who coached a women's club in Ontario, ran special on-ice instructional drills. And just as an aside, O'Byrne and Dryden were very close friends, dating back to the 1960s, when the two went to Peterborough to try out for the Peterborough Petes of the OHA. O'Byrne made the team. Dryden was cut. And he ended up, as of course, playing his college hockey at Cornell University. In the academic sessions for that 2004 conference, the more than 40 paper presentations ranged from biographies of former players Bobby Rosenfeld and Hilda Ranscombe to the politics of representation in the Hockey Hall of Fame. That was Carly Adams' first stint at the conference. Body checking in women's hockey, trash talking and intimidation in women's recreational hockey, hockey across the women's life course, nutritional strategies for elite athletes, intercollegiate hockey, coaching, officiating, equipment, and training, and also a review of the published literature involving the women's game. In one particularly powerful essay, Meg Hewings, who has continued to be a leading force in the professionalization of the women's game in Canada, focused on the homosocial realm of women's hockey, the embodiment of personal and civic identities, and contested notions of what it meant to be an ideal hockey citizen. 3 volumes of papers were subsequently published: Hockey and Cultural Identities, Internationalizing Canada's Game, and Women's Hockey, Gender Issues on and Off the Ice. As it turns out, I think, the decision to collect all of these papers and to publish them in-house at the Goresbrook Research Center was a mistake on my part. Rather than selecting a few of the best papers and seeking out a commercial publisher or university press, my intention had been to include as many papers as possible, given the paucity of research that had been done around the game, and to get these volumes out as quickly as possible. And this was the rationale that we presented to SSHRC in our funding application as well. But the problem was, the Goresbrook didn't have elaborate distribution capabilities, and future researchers sometimes found it difficult to access the collections. We probably should have sought out a co-publication arrangement involving the Goresbrook Institute and an established Canadian publisher or university press. Well, that was unfortunate. But that said, it's important to acknowledge the involvement of so many active researchers in those 2 early hockey conferences. And many of them would become leaders in the continuation of the hockey conference in the years to follow, including future conference organizers Andy Holman, Julie Stevens, and Don Morrow. Andy, Julie, Jamie Dopp, Don Morrow, Jonathan Edwards, and of course Cheryl deserve special mention for turning the conference into a recurring movable feast. After Halifax, it landed first at Bridgewater State, Massachusetts, in 2005, then the University of Victoria in 2007, and then in Buffalo as a joint conference sponsored by Brock University, Bridgewater State, and University of Buffalo. In the 2005 conference, a new crop of literary scholars, such as Brian Kennedy, Jamie Dopp, and Jason Blake, address nostalgia, violence, and the imagining of the good Canadian hockey kid in hockey fiction. Karen Skenazy wrote of Leslie McFarlane's break from writing the Hardy Boy series to pen hockey stories. And of course, later, his son, Brian McFarlane, of Hockey Night in Canada fame, would be one of the important guest speakers, in fact, keynote speakers at Don Morrow's conference in London. Papers from the 2005 conference were collected for a volume edited by Andy Holman and published by McGill Queen's Press as Canada's Game, Hockey and Identity. And in addition to the people mentioned above, Greg Gillespie, Russell Field, Richard Harris, Robert Dennis, Julie Amarante, Craig Hyatt, and Julie Stevens all contributed to that conference. It's worth noting, I think, that Andy and Steve Hardy's comprehensive synthesis, Hockey, a global history, that came out in 2018 and really is the most powerful synthesis of the history of hockey throughout the world, drew extensively on the work done at this conference and others as well. And in particular, Julie Stevens' notion of convergence and divergence in hockey became a central focus of their treatment of the international hockey system. And this kind of building on the work of others has really, I think, secured the legacy of the hockey conference. After Bridgewater State, we trekked west to the University of Victoria with Jamie Dopp taking the lead. A scheduling conflict unfortunately left me unable to attend what was another impressive gathering with special guests like Harley Hotchkiss, chair of the NHL Board of Governors, well-known sports analyst and writer Stephen Brunt, not to mention Dave Whitson, Steve Hardy, and Richard Greneau, who we all know well. Randall Meggs arrived, I'm assuming, with his goalie pads in tow to read from his Sawchuck diaries. Michael Buma was presenting for the first time, as was Rich Lehman, John Edwards, and David McNeil introduced us to his work on hockey photography that was central to his recent biography of his father, Jerry McNeil. And many of you will remember him as an important member of the Montreal Canadiens as their goaltender in the 1950s. That conference resulted in another collection edited by Jamie Dopp and Richard Harrison, entitled Now is the Winter, Thinking About Hockey, Essays on Hockey as Myth, Symbol, and a Game to Please the Crowd. The 2010 conference in Buffalo, organized by conference stalwarts Andy Holman and Julie Stevens, capped off the first decade of the hockey conference with another 40 papers or so and other presentations, including appearances from special guest Paul Kelly, former head of the National Hockey League Players Association, longtime Buffalo Sabre Larry Playfair, Margot Page, a well-known member of Canada's national team and head coach at Niagara University, and a number of players and officials from the Buffalo Sabres organization. In revisiting a number of themes from early years, these meetings demonstrated how much hockey research had deepened and matured in less than a decade, and largely because of the conference. There were sessions in Buffalo on minor hockey, pucklit, gender issues, hockey in transborder and transnational settings, the representations and marketing of the game, and hockey in French Canada. By my tally, the 50 or so presentations in Buffalo brought the number of scholarly papers and presentations since 2001 to over 300. Hockey scholarship was mushrooming. The official launching at the 2010 conference of Jason Blake's Canadian Hockey Literature, a thematic study, just provided another indication of the multidisciplinary flourishing of hockey scholarship and the conference's successful initial decade. So in summing up, let me end with a couple of remembrances, personal remembrances from Buffalo. First, it marked Mac Ross's initial conference appearance. And listening to my former student speak about the early Nova Scotian Amateur Hockey League made me proud to have been his mentor, just as he made me proud and happy with some of the things that he had to say about me today. In fact, I told Mac prior to the presentation that in addition to wearing this St. Mary's jersey, I thought I might have to wear a hockey helmet because hockey is known. Mac is known as a pretty hard puncher, given his experience in boxing. Not only writing about it, but being in the ring itself. But I didn't even feel the punch this morning. At another point in the Buffalo conference, Julie Stevens introduced me as the conference's godfather. Well, if I've been pleasantly surprised by the conference's success in that first decade, I must admit that it took some time to imagine myself as a Maple Leaf version of Marlon Brando, since there were so many other important actors on that stage. Similarly, today, despite being deeply appreciative of being honored with this special session, I want to emphasize the contributions the rest of you have made as well. As obviously on those conferences, it just wouldn't have been the same without her. So with that, thanks for listening, everybody, and for being part of this wonderful collective enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. That was wonderful. All right, we do have just over 5 minutes left. Colin, are you open to taking some questions from the audience if anyone has anything they want to say?
Questions or comments, fine, you know, remembrances.
So what I'll do is ask folks if anyone has anything they want to say to raise their hands, and I'll do my best to get to you in a timely fashion. You're welcome to turn your camera on or not. Certainly turn your microphone on, or if you're more comfortable putting things in the chat, go right ahead. While I'm waiting, I also want to mention that on the Hockey Conference website, as of late last night, there is an entire section dedicated to Colin, where you can read a little bit about him, and there's also a tribute video that some of us put together as well. I have a hard time believing that some of the people on this call don't have some sort of question, comment, or insult to send to Dr. Howell this morning. Still early out in California, I suppose. Oh, Heather says good job. Thank you, Heather. Brian Kennedy says,
Thanks,
Colin. So Brian Kennedy, it's quite early for Brian Kennedy, but he says, Colin, you've changed more lives than you know. Thank you for what you've done for me. Mila Sue says thank you. Heidi Vigan says thank you. Oh, Heather says great job, Dad. Sally has a question. Sally, would you like to hop on?
Yes, just thank you for that presentation, Colin. It was excellent. And one thing I wanted to ask, publishing all the papers was a problem, and I wanted to know if there's anything in the future about publishing a collection of the Hockey Conference papers. That's all. Thank you again, Colin.
Well, one of the things that I've thought about, there were so many excellent papers in those 3 volumes. I've been thinking it might be a good idea to go back to them and select some, and then work with a commercial publisher or university press and publish another volume, because they've stood the test of time, many of those papers, and I think they deserve a wider audience than they've had up until now.
Heidi has a question, but before I get to Heidi, Brian Kennedy also added, the sequel lecture will be the 2010 to present conferences, which Colin will give at the next conference, I hope. Heidi, feel free to come on if you like.
Sure. Hi, Colin. Hi, Sandy. Hope you're doing well.
Hi, Heidi.
Can't wait to see everybody once COVID moves on. So looking forward to all of that. My question is, I mean, obviously I've spent a lot of time with you over the last few years and I'm so appreciative and, speak volumes of that, but I'll leave that for me. I have a question, which is when you reflect back on when you first started supervising and then when you sort of supervising people a little bit later on, because there's a nice journey there with all the different students. What are the things that you would give advice to us as emerging scholars when we're starting to take on our doctoral students and guiding them along the way? What are words of wisdom that you give us for that?
Well, I guess I've always thought of graduate students in the way that a good hockey coach would think about the potential of if you get the best out of them on the ice. And I say this over and over again, I am fiercely loyal to my graduate students. If they're willing to work hard and work with me, I'm willing to work as hard as I can with them. You have to be critical and you have to push students to improve. Sometimes you come to the realization that even kind of critical nudging and pushing isn't going to get your student to the level that you would like. You still people who are trying to make the best of their own lives and to be as positive in your relationship with them as it possibly can be. Negativity for the sense of negativity or as a learning tool, I don't think it ever works.
Thank you for that, and glad that I did a positive leadership PhD. That helps, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, turning back to Cheryl. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Heidi. So first, John Paris left a message that said, excellent, Colin, as usual. And next, Carly Adams has her hand up. So Carly, please feel free to come on.
Hi, Cheryl. Thanks. I hope everyone can hear me. Hi, Colin. Thank you for the lovely second, Colin, to publicly acknowledge you and to say thank you for the mentorship that you've provided me over more than a decade. And for those of you who don't know, Jason, my partner, and myself have been to St. Mary's University a number of times as a research associate, and Colin has just been, and Sandy, of course, so gracious in welcoming us and mentoring us while we've been there. At one point, they invited us into their home as well, and we had our little guy, Quinn, who was 4 at the time, and we have a great picture of Quinn sitting at a chessboard playing chess with Colin and just being so enamored with all of his musical equipment in the basement. And Sandy and Colin, we are just so grateful to both of you for your mentorship, both in academia, but just in life in general. So thank you for everything that you've done. And we can't wait to see you when we can get out to Halifax again. Thanks, Cheryl, for organizing all of this.
Thank you, Carly.
Appreciate that, Carly. We think about you a lot. And
Thank you,
Sandy
Carly.
too. Sandy's here.
I was after all this.
All right.
Oh, I hope so.
It is 11:55. We have another set of 3 congruent panel sessions starting in 5 minutes, but I am going to leave this meeting open so that if folks do want to stick around to chat with Colin, you can do that. Just please keep in mind, I'm not moderating it. And we do have another set of, I think we might have at least 15 other presentations starting up next. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Mac, and thank you, Colin. And I'm now really jazzed about the rest of the next 2.5 days.